Okay, the politically correct university, how I got into this. I'm not a raging right-wing Republican. I am a Republican. I nearly always vote that way. It's almost an emotional thing now. I tease my wife that I consider her sort of an authoritarian Unitarian, and I'm more sort of a libertarian Republican. And I virtually always vote Republican. She virtually always votes Democratic. I think we cancel each other out. But a friend of mine back at Villanova said, well, why are you doing that? Why are you writing the stab in the back book or editing the stab in the back book? And I said, well, ideally, it shouldn't be a stab in the back book. Ideally, we professors are supposed to look critically at institutions. Ideally, we should look critically at our own institutions, too. The real kind of reason I got into this, a couple of reasons. One is as a blue-collar kid who went to college, my brother and I guess, were the first in our line, at least, to go to college. I was always very disappointed. I loved college. In fact, I went and never really left. But the thing that disappointed me was I had this image that in college people would be debating great issues. And there'd be folks in the right and folks in the left and folks in the center and some radicals, and folks would actually be arguing about things. And what I found in college, there was really remarkably little of that, and even less in grad school. And I always found that very profoundly disappointing. It always seemed to me college was not all that it could be and should be. Nonetheless, I stayed in. And the other sort of impetus for it was that as an academic who usually does vote Republican, in academia I'm often thought of as a crazy right-winger. Well, in 1993, I did a 1 year at the Brookings Institution, a supposedly left-wing think tank in Washington. And then a few years later, I spent 3 years working for the Clinton administration. My people say I was in the administration. I actually wasn't. I was a little bit below the political level. Probably good. I had to tell them I voted against their boss. But I found that at Brookings and the Clinton administration, I was actually pretty much in sync with folks. I agreed with 80 or 90% of what they wanted to do. I considered them good public servants who loved the country. And a lot of times they were to the right of me on issues. I remember when I was in the civil service, one of my colleagues was bragging to me about how she had helped downsize her agency by more than a third. And even so, their customer satisfaction ratings improved, and the agency got better. And I said, wow, Teresa, were you able to find jobs for all those people? And her eyes narrowed, and she said, Bob, President Clinton does not want us to run a charity here. And people actually in government are often well to the right of even us conservatives in academia. And that sort of struck me. And the other thing I noticed in government was, obviously not on the talk shows, obviously not with the media present, but behind the scenes, people would constantly be debating issues. And a lot of times, people in the Clinton administration at Brookings would very carefully consider conservative positions, and oftentimes, in fact, they would embrace them, even when they weren't forced to by the voters. And that I found very, very striking. Among conservative academics, they exhibit a lot of the features of any oppressed minority. I remember an African-American student when I was living in a very white area of central Pennsylvania telling me that when two blacks see themselves in a certain town, they'll signify it because there's so few of them there. And, I know my best friend is gay, and he says there's signals you send and things like that. And I noticed conservative academics do the same sort of thing. They'll quietly say at a conference, I saw in the NAS thing, or I saw in academe, and conservatives all know what that means. To other people, they have no idea. Conservatives also, it's interesting, if a conservative academic, if you meet a conservative in Washington or in state government, they'll say something like, how are they treating you at that university? With the implication being that you're like a spouse in a potentially abusive marriage, that things could go south at any time. There is a lot of distrust that conservatives have for academia, really sometimes more than they should. And I guess the real initial impetus for the final sort of impetus for this was that conservatives have long complained that academia was overwhelmingly left-wing. But it didn't really become a cottage industry and an interest group and all that, I would say, until the efforts of David Horowitz, a very brilliant political entrepreneur in LA, runs the Center for Popular Culture and FrontPageMagazine.com and other such things. A former radical leftist who's become sort of a radical rightist and sort of has the same sort of confrontational tactics in a lot of ways. I've met him, delightful guy, very brilliant guy. David, I think, has a slash and burn attitude towards academia. His book, Prof Scam or the Professors, I think the Professors, listing the 101 most dangerous professors in America. Actually, a friend of mine landed on that list as people who are subverting our young people. I think that he's a former radical. David's a little over the top there. I don't think he really understands, maybe wants to understand what's going on in academia. At the same time, the American Association of University Professors, I think, is also off the mark. They constantly say there's no problem at all in academia. We have freedom of speech. We have free thought. There are no problems. And this, too, struck me as simply inaccurate. So I hatched the idea with my buddy Richard Redding, now a law professor at Chapman. He was at Villanova then, of putting together a book project, an edited book project. Because I'm getting old, I don't like to write as much. I probably edit more. And bringing a bunch of experts together and trying to see, okay, is this as serious a problem as people say? If so, why? Trying to use modern social science methods. Then look at a couple specific disciplines. And then say at the end, okay, if it is a problem, what should we do about it? And so with the help of Henry Olson at the American Enterprise Institute, who gave us a very nice grant, we did this. We had a conference back in November of 2007, and I wrote a Washington Post op-ed, I think is there on your dies there. By the way, I should also say I've got this is the book my right-wing buddies like, The Politically Correct University. Also got a book out of Stanford University Press, not known for its conservative stuff, Judging Bush. We had another conference that my left-wing buddies generally will like. My wife will stay with me for this one, at least. So we look first off by the numbers, and Dan Klein and Charlotta Stern, Dan Klein at George Mason, Charlotta Stern at University of Stockholm, put together a great summary of lots of different studies. And we do find that universities are pretty overwhelmingly left-wing. It's especially true of elite universities. So Harvard, much more so than say University of North Carolina more so than, say, Ole Miss, and so on, or Idaho State or something. And it's also especially true in the social sciences and the humanities, which is important because those are the areas where ideology matters. I mean, honestly, really, who cares if physical education professors lean Republican? It really doesn't matter much. Whereas if public policy, if international relations professors do lean Democratic or Republican, that could actually have some impact on the ideas that they're teaching. And they do a very good job of that. By the way, that one thing that some of these studies seem to report, about a quarter of sociologists and 1/6 of social scientists generally are self-described Marxists, which leads Stanley Rothman to joke that there are now quite literally more Marxists in the Harvard faculty lounge than in the Kremlin, which is or in Beijing. So that there is something a little weird about that, maybe. Now, so we make that point. Now there are really sort of, and that's a pretty clear empirical point. I don't think I don't think it can be disputed. Now, okay, so where do we go from? And by the way, you have a table there listing some of the findings from some of the studies that Klein and Stern put together. In sociology, it's well over 20-1, Democrat to Republican. In economics, around 3-1. Political science, my area, 5.5 or 6-1. History, more than 10-1, and so on. Now, there are different views of why the imbalance exists and whether it's fair or not. There's a lot of different views. Let me just summarize a few of them. Gross and Simmons, who were sociologists at Harvard, if I remember right, argue that really professors are more moderate than we think. And they make that argument because around 30% of professors are, in fact, self-described moderates. And when you add them with the self-described conservatives, I think you actually get to a little over half. The problem with that is, and back when I was teaching research methods, I would not have given that paper an A. I would have given the undergrads who did that maybe a B-. If I were to go and hang out with the Ku Klux Klan and ask them, are you guys right-wing or left-wing or centrist or whatever, guess what? Half of them would say they were centrist. People's subjective views are not necessarily very objective. So, methodologically, that's a little iffy. They also do some very strange things. For example, they collapsed to get moderates. They collapsed together a moderate, self-described moderate liberals and moderate conservatives, even though the one greatly outnumber the other. And they don't look at things like voting behavior, which when you look at that, their self-described moderates look pretty left-wing. They also lump together junior colleges with everything else. And I would argue that universities, especially elite universities, have a little more impact on the world than junior colleges do for all kinds of, which is not to attack junior colleges. I have a good friend who teaches at one. They do very important work. But in terms of the world of ideas, they're just not as important. Now, David Horowitz, I've already talked about. David argues that it's all liberal oppression. That explains why universities are overwhelmingly left-wing. And I think, and certainly there are some good examples of that. If you look at the tenure cases in Harvard of Peter Berkowitz, which is an outrageous tenure case, which I could talk about at another time. And the person who spearheaded it is now head of an Ivy League university. So universities do not seem to value honesty as much as they should. Or the Bradford Wilcox tenure case at University of Virginia, where, to its credit, the university stepped in and overruled the sociology department's original decision. There are certainly some cases of that, but I don't think David ever makes a case that that sort of out-and-out oppression of conservatives is anywhere near as common as he thinks it is. I also think David really doesn't understand how universities work. I mean, most university professors, even those on the left, even the far left, are not spending every day and night thinking, how do I get the Republicans? They're going, teaching their courses and paying their mortgages and attending committee meetings and doing all the usual things we academics do. Most of them are not nuts. Now, a common view you'll hear on the left is it's because conservatives are dumb. And I have when I wrote the Washington Post piece, I got over 300 emails. In fact, I set up a new email account because I didn't want people emailing my work account. And I remember one in particular, one spelling and grammar challenged Berkeley graduate student who's probably already teaching undergrads, writing about how, when all the stupid people in the world espouse conservative views and all the smart people are so on and so forth. And I'm like, I don't think that's quite accurate. And we actually, in our book, in the book we edit, Matt Wisner and April Kelly Wisner, who are very good political scientists, very good methodologists at Penn State, Harrisburg, and Elizabethtown College, respectively, married couple, one Republican, one Democrat. They look at undergraduate GPAs and find that actually conservatives and liberals have identical GPAs. So it looks like the professors at least think that they're equally smart. Interestingly enough, moderates have lower GPAs. They're probably mostly people who don't have any ideas at all, would be my guess. Or, ideas about maybe beer, but not so much about other stuff going on at the university. So that doesn't seem to be true. It doesn't seem like conservatives are dumb, or dumber than liberals at least. Now, the AAUP has the American Association of University Professors makes a lot of different arguments, some of which hold some water. One that does hold at least a little water, and this is from the Wisner and Wisner chapter in our book. By the way, I should say Matt Wisner and April Kelly Wisner, along with Stan Rothman, have a wonderful book coming out in about a year out of Johns Hopkins University Press. Conflict in the Academy, I think it's called, looking at all these issues quantitatively. They do a very good job. I hate to admit it's a competitor with my book, but it is very good. One little chart that they have in our book, they look at undergraduate students. That is the pipeline for PhDs, people who might go on, get PhDs, become professors. And they look at their ideology, the bottom thing, far left to far right. And then they look at what their priorities are. And something you find is that liberals, on the far left especially, are way more likely to say that they value writing original works. That is the artist temperament, the kind of folks who go to Hollywood or stage or whatever. I want to create things. And this may lead them more often to go off and become intellectuals and professors and so on. They are well ahead of that than people on the right are. They're also somewhat well ahead on developing a meaningful philosophy of life. For people on the right, most of us already have a meaningful philosophy of life. It's called our religion. People on the left, not so much, at least more variable. And I think that explains part of it. But both of those things seem to lead liberals more than conservatives to want to apply to PhD programs and become professors. I think the AAUP is right about that. Liberals and conservatives have somewhat different priorities. Let me say another priority, another difference. One huge thing there is raising a family is extremely important to conservatives, not as important to liberals. Now, when you think about, especially in the far left, now when you think about what you have to do to be a professor, and I personally am one of those right-wingers who didn't really like my family that much, I guess. I like my dad, but mostly was not very close with him. And so, when my advisor told me I should take the fellowship at the University of Minnesota because it was a really good school, I was like, wow, but it's only 1,000 miles away. Isn't there anything any further? But that's very unusual. Most conservatives actually kind of want to stay in their home state, near their families, because they love their families. That's not a bad thing necessarily. By the way, it also disadvantages women a little bit. Women, interestingly enough, some of the same policies that would promote having more conservatives in academia would also promote having more women in academia, which is a point that Matt and April make in this and some other writings. So the AUP view of that is at least partly right. Conservatives do make somewhat different lifestyle choices. That's not all of it, though. First off, that doesn't explain the huge imbalance or anything like it. And something else that Matt and April point out in their chapter is the conservatives report being slightly less close to their professors. They love college as much as liberals do, but they're slightly less close to their professors, and they're significantly less likely to be asked by their professors to do research with them, which is another gateway to getting a fellowship at a PhD program. So that is kind of a pipeline issue, that the same thing we talk about the underrepresentation of minorities in some fields, that maybe should cause some concern, I think. The AUP also argues that ideas don't matter anyway, which I think is really silly, and it's very strange to hear intellectuals arguing that ideas don't matter. I think if you believe that, then you should not be in the academy. And another argument they make that I think is just kind of silly, they have a publication, Freedom in the Classroom, they came out with about 3 years back to sort of criticize David Horowitz. And they say, well, we can't really be concerned about having a wide variety of ideas, because where would that lead? I mean, who's to say we wouldn't have Stalinist ideas and Nazi ideas and all kinds of crazy ideas? And my response to that is always that, gosh, if you can't tell the difference between Barack Obama and Joseph Stalin, or you can't tell the difference between Mitt Romney and Goebbels, I don't want you teaching my kids. I really don't think you have enough judgment to do that, okay? I mean, there are reasonable ideas and there are crazy ideas. And I think that Democratic and Republican ideas are generally reasonable. Agree with them, disagree with them. They're not nuts. They're not evil. At least I don't think they are. Though a somewhat different response, this actually comes from our book. John Agresto, very good scholar, argues that it's the nature of the liberal arts to oppose, and liberal arts in particular tend to be critical of society. That's not necessarily the worst thing. And I agree with him. I would expect there to be some imbalance left-right in the liberal arts in particular, but not 10 to 1, not 20 to 1, not 30 to 1. That to me seems going a little too far. And I'd also make the case that I think it's healthy to question society. But again, academics need to question their own institutions too, and it's harder to do that if we all agree with each other. It's way easier to do it if there's some ideological diversity around. Now, the final thing to mention, George Stigler, the wonderful Nobel Prize-winning economist, mentor to Thomas Sowell and lots of others, wrote a terrific set of essays back in 1976, I think, called The Intellectual in the Marketplace. And Louis Menand, an English professor at Harvard, wrote a similar sort of book called The Marketplace of Ideas just last year. And they both make the point, Stigler first at least, that being hired by an academic department is sort of like joining a fraternity, because any one member or two members of the department very often can blackball your hiring. In any kind of situation like that, people all try to act the same in order to get hired. And I think there is a lot of evidence that that's correct. We'll talk a little more about that in a couple of minutes. But I think there's really something to that. And something that Menand really brings to the picture is the academic job market back in the 60s was great. Professors would come out, get lots of job offers. Starting in 1975, very suddenly, from a combination of not having as many young people and having way too many PhDs, the academic job market went like that. It became horrible. Harvard PhDs were begging to get jobs at Southwest Idaho State, and where they didn't really want to be. And I always joke that academia is a very geographically mobile profession, if not upwardly mobile. One of my best friends is went to grad school with me, brilliant PhD. She's working for the CIA, actually. She's a very religious Jew. And she told me that she almost got a job at the University of Northern Iowa. University of Northern Iowa. It's a New York person. And she said, and I realized if I had taken the job at Northern Iowa, I would probably never marry. Not a whole lot of synagogues and Jewish guys up there. The difficulties of the academic job market, again, have really pushed people to have one party line. It makes people very afraid to express different points of view because it can hurt you in the job market. And that, I think, is very unhealthy. An argument that, in fact, Menand puts it best, I think, when he says that we've gone from sort of reproducing ourselves to cloning ourselves, and that is not healthy for colleges and universities, I don't think. And I don't think Louis Menand is a guy on the left by any means, or on the right by any means, but I think he's got his finger on something there. So Richard Redding and I put together this book, and we went through, and I've already talked about a lot of our findings. Let me just throw out a few others. We have very good evidence. Stan Rothman and Lichter in their chapter show this. We have very good evidence that being conservative, especially socially conservative, makes it more difficult for you to get good academic jobs. Now the main thing in terms of whether you get good academic jobs is your publication record. You can be a lousy teacher, you can be a jerk. If you publish like crazy, you'll probably get a good job, or some kind of job at least. It is a merit system. But within the merit system, social conservatism also explains a lot. It has about a third of the explanatory impact of how much you publish. They have a pretty good data set looking at that. To the point where among professors who published a book, 73% of Democrats, but only 56% of Republicans are in high prestige academic jobs. And a lot of the best, certainly in my field, political science, a lot of the best programs in the country do not have a single Republican professor. I think that's very unhealthy. Harvard has, well, they torpedoed Peter Berkowitz's tenure, so they still had Harvey Mansfield. Recently, after he got tenure, Dan Carpenter came out of the closet and announced that he was in fact a Republican. He was probably wise not to do it before then. So there's some real evidence there. Something else we talk a lot about is groupthink. How many have heard of groupthink? It's a great concept. I sort of criticize the Bush administration at times for having it too. Universities aren't the only ones. Groupthink is when a group is sure it's right, it's sure that it's well-meaning, it's sure that those who disagree with it are evil, not just wrong, but evil. And it's when a group puts more emphasis on its own cohesion than on actually solving a problem. And as I recall, I read this in grad school. It's a wonderful book, Irving Janis's Victims of Groupthink. As I recall, he came up with the concept. I should have looked this up before I came here. As I recall, he was studying a group that was brought together by health professionals to quit smoking. It's a group of smokers. And very quickly, people in the group, especially the more influential, louder people, said, well, you really can't quit smoking cold turkey. It's got to be a gradual process. It's the only way to do it. And one businessman was the devil's advocate. He kept saying, no, I think you can quit cold turkey. And the second meeting of the group, he came and announced that he had, in fact, quit smoking cold turkey. And there were a couple more meetings, and he got increasingly isolated within the group. And about the fourth meeting, he came. There were weekly meetings, and he said, I've realized that I can either be part of this group that I really like or quit smoking. I'm back up to 2 packs a day. And the group applauded. People do. We're social animals, right? People value group solidarity. That's why we have sports teams and things like that. But I argue in academia especially that can often be very unhealthy. It can lead us to overlook very good arguments. It can lead us to stereotype others in ways that are unhealthy. It's true whether you've got all left-wing sociologists or all white male corporate executives. It's a general function of how human organizations work, an unfortunate part of our humanity. Okay, so we've explained sort of, I think, why it's a problem, and it really is a problem. I say it doesn't matter. Well, about 29% of undergraduates claim that there are some professors that they've had dealings with that you'd sort of have to toe the ideological party line to get a good grade. Now it's 29% overall. In political science, it's actually a bit less of a problem. I'm from a relatively moderate discipline for reasons I could talk about. And I do talk about actually in a chapter in here with Jim Caesar. But it's still a problem. We have some pretty good data on that. It's not the enormous sort of problem David Horowitz makes it out to be, but it is a problem. Which, if 29% of the African Americans are women in organizations, so they felt discriminated against, I think we'd see that as a little troubling, right? So I think this is somewhat troubling. I think actually a bigger problem, though, is in the ideas that people are exposed to. I did some adjunct teaching at a small liberal arts college, very good college outside Philadelphia that I won't name. There's 3 of them it could be. In a good college, it was a nice place. I found out a couple of things. A friend of mine who hired me, who's a liberal Democrat, said one of the sociologists told all the students never to take my course, which I thought was kind of amusing. But I look at their list of speakers and realize you could probably be there 4 years as an undergraduate and never have an outside speaker who would portray conservative or libertarian ideas in a positive light. And that means your education is being restricted. You're not getting a full range of views. You're not getting a full range of ideas. And probably neither are your professors. And that, I think, is unfortunate. I think there's another way. There are 4 other ways it hurts colleges and universities quite a bit. One is just boredom. I mean, you know, I always make the case that some university out there is going to figure out that if you had Oxford-style debates, maybe you guys could do this down here, maybe we could do it up at University of Arkansas. If you had Oxford-style debates every week, and, you know, heck, give students undergraduate credits for attending, have them write papers on them, liberals versus conservatives, or other views too, I think it would be a real recruitment draw. I think there'd be a lot of students who would find, a lot of high school students who would find that really cool and would want to go to a university that did that. And you know, I think it's just when we argue about very, very narrow, technical, arcane things and don't engage in the broader world of ideas, I think life's pretty boring. And I think universities too often are boring. In fact, an argument that the T. Manley Somerville, Somerville, his last name is Somerville, writes in The Decline of the Secular University. He's a history professor emeritus at the University of Florida. An argument he makes is that our modern public universities are pretty good at teaching people how to make money, get credentials, get a good job. We're very bad at teaching people what to use the money for. I think there's a lot of great arguments we could have about that. So boredom, I think, is one sort of problem. I think a problem is we don't do as well as we should in producing good citizens. I think with faculty focusing too much on their narrow specialties, not being engaged in the broader world of ideas, including the world of ideas that they may not agree with, I think hurts the way we prepare undergraduates. And I'm not explaining this very well, but it distorts our focus. Ann Neal has a good chapter in our book pointing out that at elite universities, actually, you test freshmen on their knowledge of American history. You test seniors on their knowledge of American history. Seniors know less than the freshmen. There's something very disturbing about that. Us focusing too much on our specialties, and often our ideological specialties, is not a healthy thing. Victor Davis Hanson has a good chapter in here on a history upside down, on PC history. He points out University of California, Santa Barbara, not a marginal school, a very good university. He looked at their history department course offerings, 62 courses on Chicano studies, not a single course in the Civil War. Now, I think Chicano studies is important, but I really think, there's an easier argument to make here in Arkansas, but I think really anywhere, I don't think you can understand America without understanding the Civil War. That's a real problem. So I don't think we produce citizens. You can't be a good citizen unless you're a reasonably well-informed citizen. I don't think we do that. And PC University is part of the problem of that. I think one problem is legitimacy. After Hurricane Katrina, African Americans could look at the Bush administration and, you know, understandably, raise some questions about, are they representing us? That's a natural thing. I think that mainstream Americans, who are more conservative than liberal, actually, can look at universities and say, with that lopsided 10-to-1 margin, liberal to conservative, are they representing us? Do they represent our ideas? Do they understand us? A lot of times I'll read things by political scientists that, gosh, actually this is by a journalist, that book, What's the Matter with Kansas? I thought, gosh, clearly that guy's never been to Kansas. I don't think universities understand conservatism very well because there's no conservatives in their midst. So they write a lot of things that they're just silly. I think that's a real problem. They lack legitimacy. And when we come to policymakers and make policy recommendations, a lot of times they don't trust us because they figure we're off on some other planet. And sometimes they're right. And that dives into what I actually think is the biggest problem of the PC University, which is that we don't do as well as we should in helping solve social problems, because we don't diagnose those problems as well as we should, because we don't have a wide range of views within our departments. Martin Kramer wrote the book Ivory Towers on Sand. Actually came out, I believe, just before 9/11. It was published in 2001, making the case that Middle East Studies departments, because they were overly politically correct, didn't really understand the challenge of political Islam. And because of that, didn't really understand the potential issue of terrorism. I actually was arguing against that point of view, and then 9/11 happened, and I said, gosh, you know, maybe Kramer has a point there. I think my views were disproven by that. Mark Falkoff at AEI told me one time, he said, you know, there are dozens of master's theses and doctoral theses in Latin American studies about the evils of the Pinochet government, as there should be. It was a pretty evil government. It would be very, very hard to do one in most departments on the evils of the Castro government. Your professors wouldn't like it. People wouldn't take that point of view. You might feel like you'd have trouble getting a job. That limits our ability, I think, to produce foreign policy professionals who are going to give us a foreign